Most Christians have heard of parables like the Prodigal Son and the Good Samaritan, but there's one parable that almost never gets preached on. Surprisingly, it contains some of the richest wisdom in regards to wealth, influence, and eternity. So what makes this parable so unpopular, and what could the meaning be? Today we're going to dive right into one of Jesus' most misunderstood teachings, the parable of the Shrewd Manager. Now, interestingly enough, this parable only appears in Luke's Gospel, found in chapter 16, verses 1 through 9. So what's the story? Jesus tells a story about a wealthy man who discovers that his manager has been wasting his possessions. So he calls the manager in and says, "Give an account for your work, because you're fired." The manager immediately begins thinking, "What am I going to do now? I'm not strong enough to do manual labor, and I'm too ashamed to beg." Then the idea hits him. Before leaving his job, he calls in everyone who owes his master money. To the first debtor, he says, "Take your bill and cut it in half." He asks another, "How much do you owe?" The man answers, 1,000 bushels of wheat. The manager replies, "Take your bill and reduce it to 800. By lowering their debts, the manager earns the goodwill of all these people before losing his position. But then comes the surprising part. Instead of condemning the manager's strategy, the master commends him for acting shrewdly. Jesus then says that the people of this world are often more shrewd in dealing with temporary things than God's people are in dealing with eternal things. He concludes by saying, "Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings." After hearing this story, many questions come to mind. The first one being, why would Jesus commend a dishonest manager? And to make matters even more confusing, Jesus sums it up by saying you should be like the shrewd manager. So what's going on here? I believe the best way to answer that is looking at a common teaching pattern that Jesus used throughout his parables. When Jesus told parables, he frequently used unexpected or even deeply flawed characters to emphasize his point. Jesus intentionally did this to give the lesson he was trying to teach the spotlight rather than the character he used. Take the Good Samaritan, for example. To the average Jewish listener, a Samaritan would have been one of the last people you'd expect to be the hero. Centuries of religious, cultural, and ethnic hostility had created deep resentment between Jews and Samaritans. Yet Jesus intentionally chose the person everyone expected to be the villain to teach that loving your neighbor has nothing to do with your background and everything to do with your actions. Or consider the parable of the persistent widow. The judge is described as a man who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. Jesus isn't comparing God to a corrupt judge. He's making an argument from the lesser to the greater. If even an unjust judge will eventually respond to persistence, how much more will a perfectly just and loving God hear the prayers of his children? You see, the same principle is at work here in this parable. Jesus chose a dishonest manager not because dishonesty is admirable, but because he wants one thing to stand out above everything else, that being the manager's foresight. Think about it this way. If Jesus had used an honest manager, then as soon as he was let go, people would think, "Oh, God's going to take care of him because he was honest and faithful," which is true, but that introduces an entirely different principle from the one that Jesus was trying to emphasize here. Instead, Jesus intentionally chose someone with obvious moral flaws so the audience wouldn't focus on the man's character. They would focus on the one quality Jesus wanted them to notice. So to bring everything full circle, no, Jesus is not endorsing dishonesty. He's using a dishonest manager to spotlight something entirely different. The manager understood that his present resources could be used to prepare for his future. That's the lesson Jesus wants us to wrestle with. Now, after reading this parable, another question arose for me, which was, why didn't the dishonest manager just take some money on his way out? He was already dishonest. Why would he use the last little bit of authority he has to lower other people's debts? Wouldn't it make more sense to just steal some money on your way out? That way you have it in your possession? But then I realized something. If the manager had simply stolen more money, he may have had more wealth for the short term, but he also would have become a wanted thief. Even if he somehow escaped prison, he could never escape his reputation. Who would hire him? Who would trust him? Who would welcome him into their home? No one. Instead, the shrewd manager uses the last little bit of power left to lower other people's debts, securing his future by trading power for future relationships rather than power for money. You see, this is where the parable really clicked for me, because it's not just about having good foresight and being able to project into the future and see a certain result, but it's a revelation of your heart and how you value things. Instead of trading temporary power for more money, he traded temporary power for friendships. You see, all the physical, it will one day pass. We don't take anything from this life into the next one with us. The shrewd manager didn't use the temporary to get more temporary. He used temporary to get something eternal, which was lasting friendships. This is the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach us, to use temporary to influence the eternal, to bless people, to point others to Christ, to invest in things that outlive us. That's the lesson. Use the temporary to influence the eternal. And this makes a lot of sense when you read the text after the parable, which says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will be dishonest with much. Did you catch what Jesus said? He called worldly wealth very little. The very thing our culture spends its entire life chasing, Jesus describes as very little. Then he asks an incredible question. If you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? You see, this is the point of the entire parable. It's Jesus is contrasting two different kinds of wealth. On one side, you have the worldly wealth, money, possessions, influence, and everything this life has to offer. On the other side, you have what Jesus calls true riches. That's kingdom impact. That's people, lives changed, eternal reward. That's the kind of wealth that will still matter 1 billion years from now. Jesus was changing people's value system, turning it upside down. The things of this world, all the physical, it's very little. But the things that last forever, that's eternal. That has infinite value. Physical blessings are real blessings that come from God, but they're not a destination. They're a tool used to impact what really matters, which is eternity. This is what the shrewd manager understood. He understood that making the trade-off of temporary power for more temporary money was not the right play. It was trading temporary power for lasting friendships. And in the same way as believers, we should trade all our temporary things for eternal impact and eternal reward. You see, this parable, it puts a mirror in front of us and says, what am I doing with what God has entrusted me? Because one day, every dollar, every possession, every opportunity, every ounce of influence, it will pass. And the only thing that will remain will be what you did for the kingdom of God. And that is what the parable of the shrewd manager is all about. If you enjoyed this or found this valuable, be sure to leave it a like, a comment, and maybe consider subscribing. Thanks for stopping by, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.